What I will tell you all is, I know this is, we're not starting for what, another 5 minutes or so, but Anglican TV asked if they could film one of my sessions. And so they specifically instructed, and Jenny, can you get the handouts please for everyone? They specifically instructed, they said, will you deliver your content in 30 minutes? Because we want to be able to disseminate it to lots of people in lots of places. And so here's going to be our focus. It's not, well, it actually is andragogically correct. They say adult learning, which is andragogy, pedagogy is children's learning. Adult learning says that you need to give adults content for no more than 30 minutes and then let them process it. And so what I did in the last hour was more, little bit of content, a little bit of interaction, a little bit of we did it more throughout. This, they said, we want you to deliver the content in 30. Bang. So I'm going to, originally I was told 45, so I'm going to have to nail it. So I'm going to nail the content by God's grace. Pray for Gary. No. And then here's the bonus for you guys. Then we're gonna unbutton that sleeve and unbutton that sleeve, and then we can have 45 to work through Tim's issues, Hall's issues. By the way, everybody, let's do this together. On your feedback, let's tell everybody to make the fonts bigger. Agreed? Because you're looking at people's belly buttons, going, I'm sitting here looking at you trying to go, make the font. We all know we're at New Wineskins. So, New Wineskins. And if they're recording this, send this back to the people who know. New Wineskins small, names big. Yeah, and locations, yeah, big. Just put real big, Gary, Denver, Oh yeah, and so you're doing this, and you feel weird because you're looking at like their stomach, and yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, yeah, I'm not staring at you, really. So, good. Now that we have those funny, awkward things out of the way, I am thrilled, just in general, before we get started here, that you've all come. And so, what we're going to do is whenever we get started here, briefly, we'll be walk through what are just 10 wonderful examples of lessons from Paul. I'm not ashamed of this. I'm a Pauline scholar, New Testament scholar, and I absolutely love the fact that Paul worked on a major stewardship effort called the Jerusalem Collection, and that I actually think that if we look closely at it, there's 10 things we can find that actually address some of the biggest challenges we face in doing these kinds of efforts. So I don't want to begin yet. I'm close. Sorry, it's me wanting to jump right in. Jen, and whenever Jen says that, she's right. Let's do that. So the other thing, so when we finish the 30 minutes of material, which they want, so we're going to do 30 minutes of material, then we're going to go back through and talk about different examples of ways those things are good. I'll probably cite ones during, for the sake of the proverbial studio audience, but then we're gonna do this interactively, because in a room like this, there's a lot of wisdom already in here, a lot of good experiences from your work, nationally and internationally.
So after that half hour, they're gonna turn that off, right?
Right. Here's what he said. Gary, you nail the material in a half hour, and then just like literally look at the camera and say cut. Because he turned it on because he has 4 cameras rolling in multiple rooms. So he's already turned on like he's going around room to room. So the camera's on. So once I say we're going to begin, then our 30 minutes are going to roll. And then once I say, am I in the screen?
Yeah, your head's pretty close to the top, but I'm not touching it.
You're not touching it, So once I say then our 30 minutes are done. Ed, good to see you. Once I say our 30 are done, then we're going to drill down. So what's fun is you guys actually get 45 minutes of fun interaction, which, yeah, I think that'll be good. How about before we begin and start our 30 minutes live, let me say a prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for the people in this room. They serve the Archbishop, they serve bishops, they are bishops. They serve local congregations. They are rectors. They serve in a variety of capacities. They are missionaries. They serve on missions committees. One thing they have in common is this. They get to rally God's people to participate in God's work in a variety of ways, through local church ministry in a parish, through missions around the world, and everything in between. To do this, we thank you. There are insights from your word. And so as we open your word today and look through it, we look forward to what you're going to teach us, and we ask that your Spirit guide that instruction in each of our hearts. We ask all this in the name of Jesus, our risen Savior. Amen. Right. We're going to go ahead and begin the recording. I want to thank you all for being here, whether you're joining us on Anglican TV or whether you've joined us at the new Wineskins conference. It's a joy to talk about stewardship for the kingdom. This seminar for missionaries, mission committee members, church leaders, whether you're a bishop or a rector, is rooted in three assumptions. And overarching those three assumptions is this reality that we believe our work is not just raising up gifts for local church ministry. It's not just raising up gifts to fund a mission effort. It's we get to raise up givers to be rich toward God. And these three assumptions that our comments today are going to be rooted in are these. One, generous giving is the result of God's work, not man's work in the lives of believers. We see this in Galatians 5:22 and 23. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. But that word goodness, it's actually a lost word in our society today. Goodness is an expletive for what we say when we drop our tray in the cafeteria. And in reality, that Greek word agathosune means good works or generosity. And so the fruit of the Spirit is generosity. Look it up in your NRSV or in your Greek English lexicon. When generous giving happens, it's the result of the Spirit's work in a person's life. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that generosity flows from transformed hearts as they're conformed to the image of Christ, who's generous. So when we see the generosity taking place in the early church and people releasing their resources and setting them at the apostles' feet, we see this because God's worked in their lives. Their lives are conforming to the image of Christ, who emptied Himself. They are emptying themselves. The third thing, and I have come to see this in all my years of working with givers, our work then is not to seek transactions or gifts. Our work is to encourage transformation in people's lives. It's to encourage them to be givers who are rich toward God. And Paul says this in Philippians 4. He says, it's not that I'm seeking a gift, but what may be credited to your account. He wanted people on an eternal perspective to become known as givers. And the reality is that we as leaders face people who are all on a journey. They're on a journey somewhere between Luke 12 and Mark 12. And you say, what's in Luke 12? Well, that's the rich fool who thought life consisted in the abundance of possessions. You know, if we follow the world's narrative, the world's teaching, that's what we'd think. Yeah, that's where life is found. He who has the most toys wins. In reality, the kind of steward, the kind of giver that Jesus celebrates is in Mark 12. It's the widow. Of all characters, He picks a widow. One who has probably limited capacity to care for herself, who gives what? Sacrificially. So we have this continuum. Life consists in the abundance of possessions. It's all about me for me, or one who empties themselves as Christ emptied Himself. People are all on that journey. And if we want to encourage their growth in the journey, we must be growing in this journey. And so I'm going to give you today 10 insights from Paul's Corinthian correspondence. 10 insights for encouraging stewardship for the kingdom. And let me give you the context of these insights. In 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, we see Paul talking about the participation of the Corinthian church in the Jerusalem collection, which took place for Paul from about 53 to 58 AD. So the first thing we want to acknowledge is it took time, okay? And in this time, he wrote them a few letters. And in these letters, he tried to rally Stewardship for the Kingdom. He tried to rally their participation in an effort, similar to the efforts that you might be rallying people to participate in. Let's look at these 10 insights. And from each one, I believe, we can find tips or practical insights that will help us in our parish, in our mission work, as we encourage stewardship for the kingdom. Number one, and we'll go through 10. Number one, Christian leaders direct God's people to give when needs arise. We see this in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. It reads, "Now concerning the contribution for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so also are you to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that contributions need not be made when I come." Why is this important to start off with? First, we see that Christian leaders, they don't ask. They don't come begging. They provide instruction. They direct. It says literally, Paul's saying to the Corinthian church, I'm not singling you out. This is how I'm teaching all the other churches. As I directed the churches of Galatia, so also are you to do. On the first day of every week, put something aside. What's Paul doing? Here's the tip. You ready? People need stewardship instruction. If we want them to be stewards for the kingdom, we get to teach them to do this. In a research study of thousands of churches, in a research study, George Barna found that the Apostle Paul's teaching here is spot on. He found that churches that were vibrant in raising up stewards for the kingdom were churches that did what? That engaged in providing stewardship instruction. Listen to how funny his research study results were. Churches that talk about stewardship instructions one Sunday a year, we commonly call it Stewardship Sunday, saw more generous stewardship for the kingdom than churches that talked about it 0 times. Churches that talked about it twice a year more than 1, 3 more than 2, 4 more than 3, and you start saying to yourself, wow, well maybe we need to talk about this, right? Well, his study found that the Apostle Paul is spot on in talking about it here and directing people, because churches that provide clear instruction throughout the year for stewards are the churches that, like off the charts, see generosity and stewardship for the kingdom. So we see Paul speak this way. What's interesting is, let's say a few years after Paul, we see Clement of Rome, the Bishop of Rome actually, provide this specific instruction for the people. He says in 1 Clement 32:2, he says, "Let the one who is strong take care of the weak. Let the weak show due respect to the strong. Let the wealthy provide what is needed for the poor, and let the poor offer thanks to God, since He has given him someone to supply his need." So what do we see here? We see the bishop providing clear instruction for the people who don't have enough or have more than enough that they get to share with one another. He provides instruction. This is good advice for us as we serve in different leadership capacities. We get to provide instruction for people. Now that instruction should flow out of our own example, which leads us to point 2. Christian leaders see to it that giving is handled with integrity before God and man. The tip is we must nurture trust by our example, by good communication, financial audits, accountability, and annual reporting. Don't take my word for it. Listen to Paul. He says, "When I arrive, those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem, if it seems advisable that I should go also, they'll accompany me." And then he says in 2 Corinthians, "We intend that no one should blame us about this liberal gift which we're administering, for we aim at what is honorable not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of men." So Christian leaders should perhaps unbutton one sleeve and unbutton the other sleeve and show by example that they're going to handle this effort with integrity. And when they do that, it builds trust and confidence. And that they're going to have people of integrity participate in the leadership of this collection. And the goal here is to not just do what's right before man, but to do what's right before God. Now, the first point was about our teaching. This is about our example and involvement in the process, right? Our example must be one where we show that we're going to be beyond reproach in everything we do. So our reporting and our communication must be clear about what we're doing with the Lord's resources. And it must be true in our own lives. Our own participation should be evident. Now, at this point, one clergyman from down under in Australia, Phil Colgan, has these comments. He says, our leading is not just teaching. In other words, it's not just telling people to take up a collection and participate. We've got to be doing this ourselves. He says, if we preach what the Bible says in this area, and we're not living unchanged middle-class lives, we're hypocrites. If we ask people to be generous, but we ourselves are not giving generously, we're hypocrites. And I love how honest he is, because quite honestly, in my own journey, I realized for many years I was giving, perhaps a percentage, but not giving generously. I wanted others to be generous, but I wasn't necessarily giving generously. And so whatever activity we want to see from others, we must emulate ourselves. So this is true whether you're overseeing the missions committee, whether you're the bishop, whether you're coming alongside the archbishop. We need to demonstrate the kind of activity we want others to emulate. So that means putting controls in place in people handling how money is handled. I was speaking with someone in a third world setting at this new Wineskins conference, and they said part of what was helping our mission, part of what was contributing to the struggle of our mission was that funds weren't being handled properly. And when we put in appropriate controls, it not only made sure that funds weren't being siphoned off by people, but it also boosted confidence for others to participate. And then we further communicated just what God was doing on the field. Others wanted to be involved. And so literally what we see in this instance is the Apostle Paul is building confidence of the Corinthians, letting them know that funds would be handled properly. This needs to accompany our instruction. Let's move to point 3. Sacrificial giving is the result of God's work, not the Christian leader's work. So our tip is to inspire with stories of God's work in people's lives. Now don't miss this. When we tell stories, it isn't, I'm telling you this story because I want you to like me and give me money. No, it's telling stories of God's work and just freely inviting people to participate. That's how Paul rolled. Let's just read it. 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 5. He says, we want you to know, brethren, about the grace of God that has been shown in the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of liberality on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own free will, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this not as we expected. But first they gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Now, let me hone in on a couple phrases in there. They gave themselves first to the Lord. Remember, generosity is a result of God's work in people's lives. When God works in their lives, they serve hilariously. They give generously. They participate in the Lord's work. They pray fervently. And so it's no surprise here how the fact that the Macedonians participate, but the fact that they gave beyond what was expected is something that we've seen, haven't we? If we often participate in some kind of a funding effort, we see that the people we thought would give a lot maybe don't give a lot, and the people we never dreamed would give a lot give incredibly sacrificially. And so if we look at that, it's because what's happening here isn't financial transactions. We're seeing spiritual work of the deepest level take place. We're seeing God at work in the life of a person. And as a result, them realize that all that God had done for them and blessed them was so they could be a conduit of blessing to others. And so they wanted to deploy that. And so what we get to do often, though, is tell these stories. So just like Paul told the story of the Macedonians, John R.W. Stott tells us we can inspire others to greater generosity by telling them about the generosity of others. In other words, by telling stories of where God is at work in a person's life, it often inspires growth in the lives of those who hear those stories. His desire was to encourage the Corinthians to grow in generosity. I like how Waldo Werning puts it. He says, the great predicament in the church is not a lack of finances, but a lack of stewardship, understanding, and training in God's Word, which alone provides the direction and power for Christian giving. Provide a person with understanding, and he or she will likely make a proper response through the Spirit's guidance. Let's start with children, shall we? If we take children, here's what research shows. If you sit by a child in a service on the first Sunday and you give them a quarter before the offering comes by, and you show them how to put it in, and then you do it the second week, guess what happens by the third week? As the offering is about to take place, the child will elbow you, nudge you, or look to you for what? They will look for that gift because they realize they get to participate. That is the most basic level. It's called imitating. They don't understand the why of all of it, what it's going for, that it's this act of worship out of obedience where we get to model God's generosity by enjoying and sharing His blessings to us. They just do as you show them how to do. Well, we as Christian leaders get to do this with people. We get to show them how to be involved. So for children, it's basic modeling activities like that. But as they get older, our people need a stewardship understanding and training. One Episcopal minister, Clowen, he wrote a book called 61-Minute Stewardship Sermons because he learned that if I integrate stewardship every Sunday of the year, I'm going to have a congregation that's characterized with generous stewards. In other words, they don't just need me to do some gimmicks and tactics to get them to release a gift or two. They need my help to grow as stewards of all their gifts and their goods and the gospel. Let's say you forget everything else I teach. Those 3 G's are what we're stewards of, right, in the kingdom? We're stewards of what? Our spiritual gifts that God gives us, 1 Corinthians 12:7, for the common good. We're stewards of our material goods, to whom much is given, hey, much is required. Well, guess what? What convicted me early in my journey was I went to a website called globalrichlist.com, globalrichlist.com, and I typed in my salary. At the time, it was $50,000 US. Typed that in, and I learned that at $50,000 US, I was in the 99th percentile of the richest salaries in the world. At that point, I realized, wow, I've been richly blessed. So I get to be a blessing to others. But that blessing only started to flow as God worked more in my life. And as I started to realize that the purpose of that blessing was not just to hoard for myself, but to share with others, share with my local church, share with missions. Let's move on to point 4. Grow in the grace of giving just as you excel in other aspects of the faith. Now this one's a critically important thing to realize, because this is not just about money. This is just an aspect of the faith. In other words, we're stewards of gifts and spiritual gifts and material resources, and we want to use those gifts and goods to do what? Make known the gospel, gifts, goods, and gospel. Well, this growing in the grace of giving is one aspect of the faith, and I believe, well, we see this in 2 Corinthians 8:7, now as you excel in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge and all earnestness and in your love for us, see that you excel in this gracious work also. So our goal should be that this be something that's just an aspect of the faith we help people understand in the rhythms of the church year. Now let me make a critical point here and say, it's important that if every February we give the annual report, let's give that annual report every January or every February, because people will start to look for that. Just like that little kid looked for the quarter to put in on the third Sunday. If you want to build that confidence in your constituents that things are being handled properly, have that rhythm that says we're going to do things on a consistent basis. And have this be a part of the fabric of your congregation. But be a congregation that lives in a posture perpetually of dependence on God. William MacDonald says, God's will is that our lives should be a perpetual crisis of dependence on Him. We defeat His will in our lives when we lay up treasures on earth. Now you say to yourself, well, goodness, this is an aspect of the faith, giving is. And so if it's an aspect of the faith, what should it look like? And I would say it should look like the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. It should look like that we are constantly enjoying and deploying God's resources such that we're in a position of daily dependence on the Lord. that we look like people who are hilariously giving like the Macedonians. Let's move to point 5. Sometimes Christian leaders get to follow up and remind God's people to give. So we've learned so far that we get to teach people. We want to model what we're teaching and nurture trust in people's lives. We want to inspire them with stories and don't make this just about money. But guess what? We get to send reminders too. It says, 2 Corinthians 8, 10 and 11 says, "In this matter I give my advice. It's best for you now to complete what a year ago you began not only to do but to desire, so that your readiness and desiring may be matched by your completing it out of what you have." I want to make 2 points about this. First, he gets to remind them, hey, remember what you committed last year? You get to follow through with it. So 2 Corinthians is thought by many in part to be a reminder letter to the Corinthians. Hey guys, remember what you said you'd do? Could you please complete it? But also, notice he says, complete it out of what you have. How many times have we interacted with people who said, well, I think when I make this big business deal, then I'm going to make a gift. And then what happens? That business deal doesn't go through, and they really missed out on the opportunity to participate in that effort in the local church or that missions project. What we encourage people to do is to give out of what they have. Because our stewardship decisions aren't based on what we don't have. They're based on what we do have. Now, most people in today's congregations, let's just call it like it is, they're saddled with debt. And that's true because the world's messages and the economy of this world have pounded them to believe that life consists in the abundance of possessions. They've pounded them to think that happiness is found in having all these things. And even if you don't have the resources, you can get these things with no money down and no payments till 2015. And if that sounded like an infomercial, I mean, that's what we hear every day. Dan Busby says, giving doesn't just happen. Most of us don't give as much as we should because we don't plan our giving. You may need to make some tough financial decisions in order to have the freedom to give more. You may need to reduce your debt load or opt for a simpler lifestyle. You might even need a budget. One of those USA Today factoids recently said that 70% of Americans don't even live on a budget. Well, the Apostle Paul says your giving's out of what you have. Well, Americans have been trained by our materialistic society to live on more than you have, and we are the first people in the history of humanity that has figured out how to live on $1.10 out of $1. I don't know if you know that, but collectively we spend more than we have, and we've figured out that we can hit the reset button called like bankruptcy or something and just kind of start over and not be even fiscally responsible. So what we get to do, notice I said we get to do it, what we get to do is often help people in our congregations who've been pummeled with the economy of this world thinking. We get to teach them to do what? We get to teach them to give first, to live simply and frugally, so that maybe even they have something to share if they come upon a broken and hurting person that month. So that we're not like the religious leaders in the Good Samaritan story who just go their way and don't see that broken and hurting people beside them, but so that we become people who have resources to deploy to that person because we're willing to live on less so that we can bless. We might need to live on a budget or teach people to live on a budget. A lot of churches use boxed programs that are out there, such as, we've talked about a number of them earlier today. They use programs such as a Crown Financial Peace University, or other type budgeting thing to teach them basic budgeting. Here's the thing to remember in that. If you just say, oh, well, we talk about stewardship only in there, then what you've done is you've forgotten your critical role of doing it to your congregation. I like to remind leaders that those boxed programs are kind of like an emergency room at a hospital. If someone comes to you in crisis, don't just help them back on their feet and learn to live within their means. But keep providing that stewardship instruction for your congregations. Now this brings us to point 6, which is like my favorite point, and it's my favorite because it answers the elephant in the room question in the New Testament: how much should a person give? Point 6, acceptable giving is tied to what stewards have, not what they don't have. Paul says, if the readiness is there It's acceptable according to what a man has, not according to what he doesn't have. A lot of people ask me, well, Gary, how much should I give? Richard Foster, when asked that question, he answered in this way. He said, if we're asking the question, how much of my money should I give to God, the percentage question, we're actually asking the wrong question. If we ask, how much of my money should I give to God, that's the wrong question. It's how much of God's money do I need to keep for myself, right? The difference between those is of monumental proportions. Let's look at it. Well, here's the pitfall. If we go with the law question, which is a percentage question, we do what? We say, oh, well, let's go back to that percentage, right? Let's say you make $50,000. Well, okay, I gave God $5,000. Now the rest is mine. Ooh. Not the right thinking we should embrace, right? This is all God's resources. And on this round ball called earth, if you're making $50,000, you're in the 99th percentile of the richest salaries in the world. Guess what? You're positioned for great generosity. And so perhaps if we ask that question and think about how can we live simply and frugally, we actually become positioned to be more generous. And our stewardship decisions are not based on what we don't have, but as stewards in the kingdom, our stewardship decisions are based on what we have. So I recently had a person say to me, this is a true story, they sold an apartment building for $4.4 million. And they said, Gary, what should I give the money to? And so I said, well, what's the name of your church? They told me the name of their church. He said, well, you should give it there. What other things do you support? Well, we support this. We support this. They went through actually, true story. They did 11 things, made a list. And I said, well, first of all, I said, why do you support those things? Well, God's led us to support these things. And then I said to them, well, whose resources are those $4.4 million? And of course they said, they're God's resources. And I said, well, I think you should go to God about what you should do with those resources, but I would take a hard look at that list and then ask the question, are there things not on that list you should support? And then however you feel directed. So here's what happened. This is what was funny, because the organization I served, at the time I was vice president of Denver Seminary, and so Denver Seminary is one of the names on those lists. He actually came back to me and thanked me for encouraging him to deploy those $4.4 million for the kingdom. He thanked me. And I said, so what did you do? And he says, well, we just decided that we were going to give $400,000 to each of the 11 organizations. I said, that's great. And here's what was ironic coming back. I actually had leaders from those other organizations call me and thank me because they said, gosh, thank you for not like having this scarcity mentality and going after all of it just for yourself. And I said, well, it isn't mine. It's God's. And God entrusted it to him and blessed him. Why? So that he could become fat and happy, right? No, so he could be a conduit of blessing. So he could be a generous steward for the kingdom, which is what this seminar is all about. So his stewardship decisions were based on what he had, not what he didn't have. Now, here's why this gets to the elephant in the room question. The elephant in the room question is, how much should a Christian give? And it says right here, giving that's acceptable, what a great word, is according to what a person has, not what they don't have. And so if God blesses you, you get to be a blessing. And so, but here's what happens in America today. What we see in America today is the richer a state becomes, the less generous they become. If you don't believe me, look at Giving USA. The poorest states like Mississippi are the most generous states per capita. And the richest states are the most poorest. It's because we have failed to communicate that acceptable giving is based on what people have, not what they don't have. So if we're richly blessed, we get to be a conduit of blessing. Now, if you don't like where this is going, well, let me tell you this. If we model and teach New Testament giving, which is as we're blessed, we get to bless others, we get to share and have a share in God's kingdom. Just look through the Pauline corpus. It's all over the New Testament. Here's what's interesting. We don't see the language of the tithe. Why? Well, guess what? It's law language. It would be returning people to the law. So we get to encourage people to shift from what? Percentage to participation. As they're blessed, they get to bless others. Because my goodness, if we go back to those percentages, if I'm on this round ball called earth and I've got $50,000 in a salary? Am I positioned to bless a lot of people who don't have enough? I am. So what I get to do is share generously. And so maybe a good expression to use, and scholars use this expression, the tithe is the training wheels of giving. It's like a great place to start. But don't stop there. I mean, when you were a kid, you wanted to keep those training wheels on in your teen years, right? No, take them off. Let's see what this adventure could look like, because God's the one who provides those resources for generosity. All right, let's continue. Point 7. Christian leaders describe Christian giving as sharing that leads to equality. So let's use this sharing language in this multi-channel world. Through our emails, through our newsletters, through our pulpit communication, through our one-on-one communication, through even our text messaging. Let's invite people to participate. If there's a crisis on the mission field, do you know the best way to get people to get involved in a crisis is? If you have everybody's cell phone number, text everybody. Immediately, you're going to get everybody's attention. 10 years ago, if you wanted everybody's attention, you emailed everybody. Today, it's text them. Say there's an emergency crisis. I mean, you're going to see a response like that. So we've got a multi-channel world. Use those channels to communicate messages. Use participation language. Here's what Paul did in 2 Corinthians 8, 13 to 15. He says, I don't mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but as a matter of equality, your abundance at this present time should supply their want, so that someday maybe their abundance may supply your want, that there may be equality, as it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. What's he quoting? He's quoting the manna scene. Remember the manna scene? It was, let's go all out and gather, and let's not hoard it till tomorrow, because when we hoard it, it turns to maggots. Ooh, we've all seen them. They make you quiver and shiver, okay? So don't even hoard it till tomorrow. Now don't judge them, because if we would have been in the wilderness, we would have done the same thing. Ooh, where's that food going to come from tomorrow? But if we hoard, what happens? If God provides enough for everybody and we hoard, that means somebody didn't get anything. So we get to share. Now, ultimately, sharing is rooted in faith, and the enemy is fear. What's Luther say? He says a man is generous because he trusts God and never doubts that he'll always have enough. In contrast, a man is covetous and anxious because he doesn't trust God. Now, faith is the master workman and a motivating force behind the good works of generosity, just as it is in all the other commandments. It's all about faith here, guys. We're helping people grow in faith. We get to teach it. We get to put controls, so we build confidence that we're not doing anything fishy. We get to even remind people of it. We got to model this. And if we're blessed, we get to bless others. And this is what we get to teach people. I literally had a rich person once say to me, Gary, my bookkeeper, he's a doctor. He said, Gary, my bookkeeper just told me I got to give away $300,000 by the end of the month. It was December. Otherwise, I'm going to pay huge taxes. What should I do? I said, well, he goes, well, what do you think? He goes, well, my tax person said I should go buy another Lexus, but I bought a new one last year. I said, do you need a new Lexus? No. Well, then what do you think? He goes, I think maybe I should deploy it to the kingdom because that's what you've taught me, but I don't know what to give it to. I said, well, tell me about God's work in your life this year. And he talked for then on a medical mission trip they went on. He talked for half an hour about their medical mission trip. I said, I'm thinking medical missions. But go to the Lord because it's His resources. He called me back and thanked me because they decided to set up a foundation, plop all that money in it because time was short and they didn't know where to give it and they wanted to deploy it over a few years to medical missions. So I directed him to somebody, and within 3 weeks they set up a foundation and deployed $300,000 to medical missions. What the key is I got to encourage him to realize he got blessed so that he could be a blessing. That's what a steward is for the kingdom. Point 8, Christian leaders teach the spiritual implications of earthly giving. What we get to do is point people heavenward. That's what we get to do. Paul says the point is this, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully, will also reap bountifully. That's what we get to do. We get to teach the spiritual implications of earthly giving. Jesus calls it, we get to store up treasures in heaven. Let's move to point 9. God loves cheerful givers who realize He provides the resources for giving. Don't believe me. Believe the Apostle Paul, who says, Each one must do as he's made up his mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God's able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that you may always have enough of everything and may provide abundance for every good work. 2 Corinthians 9, 7, and 8. Now, ultimately, this comes down to faith. That's why I like this quote by Ken Hughes. The challenge for us is not our wealth or lack of it, but belief and obedience. So, in other words, God says, I'm not going to twist your arm. Paul says, so we get to tell people, this isn't about twisting your arm. That's why this actually becomes fun. This is inviting people to be a part of God's work cheerfully and helping them realize that God's able to provide the resources for their generosity. The challenge for us is not our wealth or lack of it, but belief and obedience. The generous giving heart will live in this grace. And what is the grace? So that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. It's the posture of one who enjoys and shares God's blessings. That's what we get to encourage people to do. Paul went beyond encouraging them. Though when he gave instructions to Timothy, who he asked to remain in Ephesus, what did he say to Timothy? He said, 1 Timothy 6, 17 to 19, he said, command, strongest Greek verb he could use, command those who are rich in the now world not to be arrogant or put their hope in riches which are uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Now, it could stop right there. Oh, God provides us all things to just enjoy, right? No, it says to enjoy, to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. So we get to not just do one act of generosity, but this way of life, to be rich in good works and generous and ready to share. And when we do this, this is what's cool. It says, storing up for themselves a treasure of a sure foundation for the future. So something happens in heaven we don't understand. But then what's the so that clause at the end of that? Like, why do that? Why should you do that? Why should I live that way? So that you may take hold of that which is hontas zoes, that which is certain life or real life, or the life that's truly life. If you want to take hold of the life that's truly life, let go of what is uncertain, riches, and take hold of that which is certain. It mirrors his invitation to the rich man who came to him seeking life. You want life? Let go of that stuff. It's found in me. It's 100 times better than anything you can muster. And our 10th point, in stewardship for the kingdom, our 10th point is Christian giving meets needs, and the expressions of thanks bring glory to God. Be sure that in everything, God is the one who gets all the thanks and all the glory. 2 Corinthians 9, 10 through 12 says, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your resources and increase the harvest of your righteousness. And you're going to be enriched in every way for great generosity, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. For the rendering of this service not only supplies the wants of the saints, but also overflows in many thanksgiving to God. So when you urge your church to live this way, and they do, and needs are met, God gets the glory. What I love about the example of, say, Mother Teresa is this. She says, when we empty ourselves, and then God continues to do great things, who gets the glory? It's all His. It's all His glory. So when we just hoard and store up treasures and then we make a gift, who gets the glory? We do. Because it's what we did. But when we take this posture as congregations, when we take this posture as dioceses, when we take this posture as individuals of enjoying and sharing God's rich blessings, who gets the glory? God does. Now this requires, as Henry Nouwen puts it, fundraising as ministry invites those with money into a new relationship with their wealth. What I'm sharing with you is life in the oikonomia theou. It's life in the economy of God, right? When Jesus says things like, I want you to be people who don't worry about what they eat or drink or what they're going to wear, that's definitely a different kind of person. When He says, I want you to be a person who doesn't store up treasures on earth but stores them up in heaven, we're a different kind of person. When we're a person who then says, okay, what do I do if I need something then, God? What does He say in the Sermon on the Mount? He says, ask. If you need something, ask the Father. You can even use my name. We become different kind of people. So when we are teaching stewardship for the kingdom, we're inviting people to be different. But all this calls us as bishops. All this calls us as rectors. All this calls us as missions committee leaders to be converted in relationship to our needs, as Nouwen says it. We start realizing who is our provider, who is the one who provides all things richly for us to enjoy and share. God is. So then we no longer see people with wealth as money trees to shake. Because when we do that, we actually abuse them. We see them as stewards who need our assistance. My favorite, I guess I'm going to close with a funny scene from a movie because a lot of people have seen it. I love the scene from Lord of the Rings. You remember the scene in Fellowship of the Ring? They're in the Shire. Gandalf visits his friend Bilbo, who's got what? He's got the ring. And he says, Bilbo Baggins, I want you to leave the ring behind. What's Bilbo say? Well, you're just trying to rob me, Gandalf. That's, people with riches could think that's what we're trying to do by giving them this instruction. You're just trying to rob me. Now, what Paul would say to the Corinthians, what I'm saying to you, what we get to say to others is, look, in encouraging you to participate with God in His work, as He's blessed you, be a blessing. What did Gandalf say? He said, Bilbo Baggins, leave the ring behind. I'm not trying to rob you. I'm trying to help you. Friends, the reason Paul gave these instructions in his Corinthian correspondence wasn't because he was trying to rob him. It was because he was trying to help him. And I know this because when he finished his letter, most people don't end with this when they teach on 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. They don't teach the last part of his letter because in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14, you know what he says? He says, I'm about to come to you for a third time. But I don't want your possessions. I want you. You see, this wasn't about the money. It was he wanted them to understand what it meant to be a steward in the kingdom. All right, with that, we'll cut the recording. And you know what? Anytime there's a recording, it's like, I don't want to, I'm going to be watched in some place or taken out of context. What we just did was deliver 10 points real fast. Now we can go through them quickly, or now we can go through them slowly, and we can work through them. But I wanted from Paul's Corinthian correspondence to just unload those 10 points. Now, let's go back to the beginning and let's say, I'm going to ask you questions about each point, and if you mark down that you had questions, we'll give you a chance to ask them. Point 1, Christian leaders direct God's people to give when needs arise. Friends, what's the difference and why does it matter that he doesn't come hat in hand asking versus directing them? What's the difference and why? Anyone, come on. That's right. So I like how you put that first phrase, Sue. Sue from... How about when each of us talk, say like your name and like where you're at. So it's Sue from...
St. Albans,
Okay, St. Albans. So people like instructions, don't they? I mean, so if you're doing a stewardship effort with children, here's a great thing to do. Like some of you in your congregations do a little message with children before you release them. I love it. Use cookies. Show them how the resources in this world, a few people have a lot of resources and most people don't have any resources. So take 12 kids, or it's easy with 10, we can do the numbers, right? Take 10 kids in the front and give one kid 7 cookies, and one kid 2 cookies, and one kid 1 cookie, and then explain to them that this is how basically the resources have been distributed, how they exist in the world. And that one person has 7 cookies. And kids, what do you think this kid who has 7 cookies should do with these other kids who have no cookies? And guess what the kids say every single time? They should share with them. Right? So they share. Well, that's exactly what we should do with the resources we have. Or from the pulpit, you could literally say funny things like this. At the beginning of a stewardship effort, you could say, I have good news. The church already has all the resources we need for this stewardship campaign. And everybody's going to go, whoa, Frank, did somebody give a big gift? What happened, Ed? I mean, talk to me, Hall. And you're going to say, oh, no. But the bad news is it's still in everyone's bank accounts. You know, and everybody will chuckle at that point and go, ooh, you know, you just hit me right between the head and the heart, you know? I mean, you just nailed me. The reality is people want instruction. Just tell me. Give me some instruction. And what's easier for us to do is to just appeal to the law and just give them a law rather than give them a rule that will encourage growth in a trajectory of the grace of giving. It's easier. It's easier just to say, here's a checkbox, just give a tenth and then call it good. If that was what we were supposed to do, we would see that from Jesus or Paul, but we don't. It's because that actually encourages us to go the way of the law, which is, I mean, it's disastrous because we look at all the rest and say, it's mine. Well, here's what we would become. If we went that route, we would become a lover of money just like the Pharisees were. I mean, it literally says in Luke's gospel and elsewhere, it says the Pharisees, right after, you know, they call themselves self-righteous for tithing down to the mint and the spice, or Jesus labels them self-righteous. It says what? It says, and the Pharisees who were lovers of money, and that's what happens. We look at the other 90% and say it's mine. It's mine. And so what do? We follow the world's messages on that 90%. Now, I have never heard anyone disagree with Psalm 24, verse 1. What's it say? The earth is the Lord's and all that's in it. Yeah. Okay, so it's all God's. 1 Chronicles 29, what's it say? David says, you know, from the abundant blessings I'm given for this temple campaign, it all came from there. It's all His. I'm just returning to Him what's His. We get to direct or give instructions to people. And if it ever feels awkward right out of the gate, email me and I'll give you this booklet. I quoted now and in here, and I quote him a lot in the last couple days. There's a little booklet called The Spirituality of Fundraising. And Henry Nouwen, most people have read Nouwen. Like, have you guys read anything from Henry Nouwen? Yes. I mean, he's awesome, right? If you've never read The Spirituality of Fundraising, he basically gets into the fact that if you're uncomfortable talking about money, it's probably because you yourself have not gone there. You have issues in relationship to money. And as I work with clergy, I mean, because my most common role as a New Testament scholar and as a guy who teaches at a number of seminaries, my most common role is to train clergy. And when I get clergy together, every single time, the word idol comes up on the sharing day. We walk through the scriptures, Old Testament, Gospels, early church, and then when I say the next morning, how did God speak to you? Every single time I've ever trained clergy, they say, I've realized that money is an idol in my life. And the reason it's been uncomfortable for me to talk about it is because I have thought I need it. And once you say, I need blank, I'm telling you, I mean, that's idolatrous thinking. Oh, I got to have this. That's why Jesus would say things like, you just seek me, and all that other stuff, I'll take care of. I mean, don't listen to me. Read the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, it's for us to be people who don't give these instructions, but if it's awkward for us to direct people, to give these instructions, it's because we've got challenges. So give me an example in your church on how give me some success stories on how you gave stewardship instruction to either church or clergy. Any comments? Yeah.
10% postal Christian. We just did a capital campaign for expansion. We've had orphans with staff offices for 3 years in the cities. We got to get rid of them.
Okay.
And there was one Sunday we had a list of examples of where you could come up with your pledge.
Okay.
And it was son's finishing college for $400 a month from his apartment. We could put that in this. And there were a batch of different examples.
Okay.
Kind of in your face, a little uncomfortable. But then in the sermon, a rector was said that list was his family's. That's what they had done. And it made it very personal. This isn't a list of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a list of, hey, if you look here, if you look there, you can find money to pledge for this. But it was what his family had done. And that made it, made it palatable and made it very, very personal.
This gets to part of what I discussed. How does the role, so what's,
you're basically saying, what's the role of example in inspiring others? It's huge. Yeah, so, in other words, being almost clear and uncomfortable. Lewis says, when C.S. Lewis was asked the question, how much should a person give? He goes, obviously, it's a long answer, and I'm not quoting it, but he says, we should give more than we can spare. Like there should be both luxuries, but things we would want to do that we can't do, that we set aside to be able to give.
And so in a word, it's sacrificial. And so what your list, though, was tangible sacrifices. Now, go ahead, Ed.
I was in charge of the leadership in raising $20,000 to build a primary school in Madagascar.
Yeah.
And we had all kinds of gifts. 43 people ended up giving gifts. And we pretty much I did go to about 7 or 8 people that I thought could give $1,000 apiece to start this, to get us started. And maybe $5,000 or $7,000, and some didn't. But then we opened it up to the congregation and just put a letter out that we're doing this, and if they'd like to be part of it, they could respond. And we got gifts from $10 to $3,000, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody suggested to Ed, why don't you go to the youth of the church and have them?
Love it.
So I'm talking to the youth group leader. These are 7th to 10th grade or something like that. And I said, Sam, Ben suggested that, maybe the kids could raise money for uniforms or something like that in school. And he says, boy, Ed, I really don't want to do that because most of the majority of the kids that come to youth group aren't from our church.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just getting it started and going, I'm really not doing that. I said, I understand that. So the woman that works with him, who owns a restaurant, small family restaurant
Okay.
in the area, she's overhearing this. And I go in coffee hour and everything, and she comes to me after and gives me this wad of bills. And I'm thinking she went to her wallet and rolled these up and I just put them in my pocket and went home, and there was $500 in that. And that really affected me.
When we've done stewardship efforts, would you all maybe by a nod concur that oftentimes the people we thought would give a lot or would give significantly don't, and then the people that we never dreamed
That's right.
would give a lot, give what we see is clearly sacrificial and cheerful, and what's interesting is we as leaders need to model and encourage others to give cheerfully and sacrificially. And
Joyce said that exact thing to me before we ever started this. She said, you'll be really surprised. Then I'm going to Florida last year, and I said, the men in our Bible study, which is half from our church and half from the Presbyterian church, but one of the men who had participated in this, a professor at our university, and I said, I hope to wind this thing out. We're within $4,000 or something to wind this up. And he said to me before I left, he said, tell me what you need at the end.
There are story upon story upon story that we can give, and the reality is all these stories, when we tell them to others, they inspire people to participate. And when I was asked to give the seminar to the missionaries, they said, what does soliciting look like in the New Testament? It's asking God, that is prayer,
Because he's the one. He tells us specifically, when you need something, go ask rich people. Not. He says, when you need something, ask me. So our posture should be one of prayer. But then, what's so awesome, and I love this, is when you see God at work in people's lives, we see Him tell stories. Let me give your story reminds me to tell the story of Matthew 26:13. This is my favorite giving story because the woman pours out the ointment worth a year's wages. And what's Jesus say? Don't miss it. He says, as long as the gospel is proclaimed, the story of what this woman has done will be told in her memory. In other words, when you see something that's hilarious, and we tell the story, like you're not telling that story to bring glory to that person. We're telling it to say, because when someone becomes attached, so attached to God that they're willing to let go of everything else so that God's work can go forward, that's a beautiful thing. And those are the stories we get to retell. We get to retell them. Let's go to the second point. Controls. Yeah.
Just one.
Sure.
I'm in agreement with stewardship ongoing all year round, but how would that come about? Would they come from the pulpit? Would it be a newsletter, monthly, you know?
It's a great question. It's all of the above. In other words, what I have found works best is when, as a team, they talk about, this is both from the pulpit as well as the leadership who oversee those communications, how are we, and whether it's a meeting on a monthly or quarterly basis, how are we going to integrate faithful stewardship in the culture of the congregation? Because churches that nurture that see it grow. Churches that don't. And so from the pulpit, it could be things like testimonies. It could be offering messages. For instance, I'll give you an example. One church during Lent chose to do like almsgiving testimonies. In other words, like testimonies of people sacrificing to help others in need. What do you think that does in the hearts of people when they hear those testimonies? Inspires them to look around them and see people in need. Testimonies. When I say offering messages, I'm talking about that sacred 3 minutes, like, before the offering or whatever. That's where Charles Clowen said, I'm gonna teach holistic stewardship throughout the year in 1 minute or less in many little things. And so it could be everything from stewardship of our giftedness, stewardship of our resources, stewardship of our time, stewardship of our, talents, treasures. I mean, it's in other words, weave it, but strategically say, well, okay, Pastor, what are you preaching on this spring? And then what could those 1 minute messages be? Or what are things we could do with the children? And so it's integrating what's going on so that when families are driving home in the car, that the kids can say, hey, what did you learn versus what they learned in the service? And so it becomes I like to say, from the cradle to the grave. In other words, from the little kids to the big kids. How are we integrating that message? It's not every week saying, give money. It's how are we as faithful steward today? And how does that fit with what the teaching is and what other instruction? That makes sense? I literally, for seminary students, when they do their paper on encouraging Christian generosity in the church setting, what many students do is an annual calendar. And they say, Pastor, do you have any idea kind of what you're preaching on over the course? And generally, they'll know 3 months to 12 months out. I'm thinking of preaching through that book and then doing this and then doing this and doing this. Well, then it would be, could we do a series of a couple events or activities that would rally participation, maybe in volunteerism or service? Could we do a series of activities? So you kind of map it out on a calendar basis and then see how it goes. But it becomes a team effort and it becomes a part of the culture of the church. Make sense? Any other examples of that? Integrating it through the year? How about where that leads to accountability? Does anyone do like any kind of annual reporting on what resources are done? They better. That's right. They better. I'm telling you, how about this? If you don't, do it, because if you do it, you're going to build confidence. And if you build that sense of confidence, you're going to build trust. And all it is saying, hey, we promised to do these things. Hey, we kept our promises.
and you become trustworthy. And what does Paul say? We just want to be found doing what's right before God and man. We handled things properly. I mean, truth be told, you guys, the one missionary I talked to said when he got down to, I won't mention the place, but when he got to this location, there was basically a lot of money being siphoned off. And all he did was put in some controls, and then all of a sudden, there was enough resources, and it built a sense of confidence. Then people opened up their pockets and would give from those missional communities, those mission communities.
Let me throw
Sure,
the crisis that we're in,
sure.
the crisis that I see in
Mhm.
the United States. We've been through a monetary situation where money has been stolen through Ponzi schemes and, whatever crises have happened generally. But as Anglicans, we're coming out of a place where the previous institution stole our buildings.
Yeah.
And so there's huge unconfidence, or there's got to be a word. There's not a lot of confidence
Skepticism.
in the structures, in leadership.
Right. Losing your building that you helped build. Yeah.
And so the old base that we were operating out of, where we could share from our largesse in essence, we now have to rent space and pay pay salaries that the endowment used to cover. So all this radical transition is going on in people's lives, and it's extreme and it's difficult, or we feel that it's hard to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. I really want to, I'm going to give you an answer I'm confident you're not expecting. When I was vice president of Denver Seminary, one of my students, whom I loved, came to me and said, Gary, will you help us plant a church? I said, who's us? There's a few other couples. And I said, so what's the deal? He said, well, because the church is a body, not a building, we want to create a church that has this as its focus.
We want to be an authentic community of people growing in the way of Jesus. Because we are the church, we don't go to church, we are the church, we're going to be the church. So we're not going to own any assets, because once we own assets, our assets own us. Once we own a building, who gets to heat it? We do. Who gets to paint it? We do. Once we own a lawn, who gets to mow it? We do. We're not going to own any assets, because our assets are going to own us. We're going to pour all the money that comes in into people and mission being the gospel and the poor. And we're going to pour it all out. And so I'm like, he's got my attention.
And then he says, and to show this, every month, the second Sunday of every month, we're not going to have a worship gathering. Because we don't go to church, we are the church. We're going to be the church. We're going to do an all-church mission trip. Now you hear churches doing this one Sunday a year where they have church outside the walls and they go out. You've heard it. We decided, let's do it every month. And what it became was the #1 outreach thing. Now, truth be told, I'm 45, and I'm the second oldest person in the church. What generation do you think has gravitated to this living out the gospel? The younger generation. And so I join you in not owning a building if you're renting space, and I have learned it's actually a gift to not own a building. We have not spent 1 minute at a leadership meeting talking about ownership issues. We have been able to spend our time focusing. Listen to how simple the budget is. It's a $120,000 budget. $50,000 goes to the bivocational pastor for salary and benefits. $30,000 to the worship admin. That's $80,000. We got 40 left. $6,000 pays our rent. We meet on Sunday nights at 5 p.m. By the way, it's the first time in my life that Sunday is a day of rest. I sleep in. church isn't till 5. It's unbelievable. My wife really likes that. She really, really likes that. Church is at 5 p.m. And then, we spend $4,000 a year on festivals. Just an aside, Deuteronomic scholar Gordon McConville taught me that the giving was the glue to the community. And by the way, people who argue for the tithe was 23 1/3%, guys. It was 10% for God, burned up. How was that, God? He liked it. 10% for the festivals. When we all came together, Frank brought the beef. Joel brought the corn. Paul brought the wine. Don't leave it at home, you know? And we got to eat something sweet, so let's just say there was chocolate grown on it. And Jenny has coffee, undoubtedly. We're the tribes of Israel, right? And if Frank didn't bring his 10th, what would we all say? We'd say, where's the beef? I'm serious. Seriously. The giving was the glue of the community. When Ed brought his chocolate, do you think we were stoked? When Hall brought the wine, we'd go, Hall, how's the vineyard doing? We would all see Hall and say, tell me the vineyard's doing good, right? The giving was the glue to the community. And then every third year, the storehouses were where? They were in the Lord's house. They would bring into the storehouse a third tithe. So every third year, another 10th for what? The Levites who had no land and the poor among us, because God cared that everybody had enough. Fast forward, an interesting nugget, I don't know, just because I thought of it, was Barnabas, a Levite from Cyprus, sells a tract of land. Levites didn't own any land. What's up with that? Friends, there's a lot of interesting nuggets we could talk about. Let's go back to your reality, and that is, you know what? God's gift to our church has been renting a facility, because you know what it's told us? We have a lot less challenges to deal with. And when we grew from 25 to 200 in like 2 years, we could turn on a dime. In Corinth, they met in Chloe's house. What do you think they did when it got too big to meet in Chloe's house? You ready? They met somewhere else. When it gets too big to meet here, they could go over there. They could turn on a dime. And what's been happening in our churches, because we've been building driven, and I'm telling you, I believe God has his hand. I mean, look, I'm defending my PhD this spring at Trinity College, Bristol. Ask Jenny and I. We've been in a variety of church traditions in our Christian journey, but if we could start over and be born in one place and stay there the whole time, we would have been born Anglican, but you kind of can't control where you get born, right? But the reality is, I think God's gift to the Anglican communion might be to say, you guys don't go to church buildings. You are the church. You don't need buildings to be the church.
We think it's an albatross around our necks in Albany. We've got 129 parishes, but there's a bunch of beautiful stone churches that were built 150 years ago, and they take more money out of. We raised $900,000 in a congregation. We have average attendance of 110 maybe, and people think they're so poor up in the north, but we raised that money, and the roof costs $300,000, a copper roof, and it's one of these buildings on the National Register, and big old Potsdam sandstone.
Right. Now, I want to be clear. Remember, let's go back to remember, I'm a New Testament scholar. I'm just going to go with what the text is. Our stewardship decisions, Frank, are not based on what we don't have, but what we have. If we have a building, what should we do? Use it. And if it's becoming an albatross, what maybe should we do? Sell it and encourage others to be proud owners of the albatross. I'm serious. And I'm not saying, notice, it doesn't prescriptively say, you can't own a building. Doesn't descriptively say you have to have a building to function. What I'm saying to you is, if we've lost our building, we haven't lost the gospel. You know, we haven't lost the reality that we can do church in a rented facility. You know, the biggest textual answer that demonstrates to me that we can do church without owning a building is it says in the latter verse in Acts 28:30, Paul lived for 2 years and ministered out of a rented house. He rented his place, and I think he functioned pretty good. Somebody else. We've totally jumped around, and we've used much of our time. I want to say this to you guys. Whether you're overseeing a missions committee, whether you're the pastor, clergy, whether you're working out of a denominational office, or wherever you fit in that whole mix, the big meta-narrative that I tried to bring to you today was that if we look at what Paul did when there was a major campaign that had to be done, was he didn't shirk the responsibilities. He was willing at the beginning. I'll even go, he says, you know, if it seems advisable that I should go. He was willing to drop everything and be involved. So the fact that you're here tells me you're willing to do your part. And I'm saying do your part. And I'm saying there's some great instructions in here to remember that we get to encourage people not using law or obligation or compulsion. Because, and I hate to say it, I've never heard of a campaign where it says, let's have everybody give $50. I've never heard of them working. You know why? Because reality is you might only have 25, you might have 300, you might have 1,000, you might only have 10, and whatever and whatever. And the reality is, if I try to predict who's going to give, that never worked either. But what's interesting is, God is my witness and my wife is here, you can ask her. I didn't miss a goal in 19 years, not because I was any good, but because I didn't want to show James to favoritism. That's what secular fundraising is. Oh, these two guys in the church, they're the rich, loaded guys. Let's schmooze them, you know, treat them favoritism, and oh, who cares about the rest of the people? No, we're not going to do that. But we're human, and that happens, and that's how the world functions, and that can't be so in the church. And so what do? All I've done in my career, this sounds hilarious, but I grew up a farmer, okay? If you want an abundant crop, what did you do if you had an acre? What did you do? You worked that acre. And you're going to have a lot of factors come, and you're going to pray like anything that God's going to give you abundant increase. And so if you got a congregation, you get to invite everybody to grow in the grace of giving. And maybe I'll leave you with this thought. Every single person you work with, you could use this, because I don't know where this one's ascribed to. I found it in numerous places. Every single person you interact with in your churches that has come to faith in Jesus Christ is on their stewardship journey. Between breathing the two words, I believe, and someday they're going to hear the two words, well done. I'm just saying, you've got to do these things to prepare them to hear those two words. It's not about getting money from them. It's about helping them be found faithful stewards in the kingdom. Let me pray for you.